Hello and welcome grade 12s to this video presentation on the Cold War Part 2, which focuses specifically on the Berlin crisis, and we will also discuss the creation of military alliances. Tension and disagreements over Germany caused the first crisis of the Cold War. Berlin, the former capital of Germany, lay deep within the Soviet zone. Many in the West saw Berlin as a symbol of freedom behind the Iron Curtain. Although all the leaders of the Grand Alliance had agreed at Potsdam that Germany would remain united, they all went against their own agreements and introduced different political and economic systems in their zones. Their actions would further intensify the tensions between them. In the Soviet zone, a communist dictatorship was established, industry was nationalized and state collective farms were set up. Economic recovery was slow, as the government rejected American aid, and the USSR forced the East Germans to continue paying reparations. In the Western zones, different political parties were formed and local democratic elections were held. Free enterprise economic practices were encouraged, and a rapid economic recovery began, helped by the Marshall Aid Plan. By 1948, the Western zones had united to form a single economic unit and they introduced a new currency. Due to economic recovery in West Germany and West Berlin, the Western currency grew stronger in Berlin and the Soviet zone currency lost its value. Stalin believed that this was clear evidence that the Western powers were waging economic warfare and that they had no intention of leaving Berlin. And so in June 1948, the USSR closed all surface routes, road, rail and canal, linking Berlin to the West. This became known as the Berlin Blockade and cut off the 2.5 million citizens in West Berlin could no longer receive supplies and contact with the Western zones. Stalin makes the first daring move, in the strategic game of brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is defined as the art or practice of pursuing a dangerous policy to the limits of safety before stopping, especially in politics. By implementing the Berlin Blockade, Stalin is trying to intimidate the Western Allies and trying to test their limits in determining how much he can get away with. It is a bold gamble, in order to achieve control of West Berlin whilst at the same time risking the outbreak of war. Some historians argue that Stalin is much more confident and braver, because they too possess nuclear weapons. In another bold strategic move, the USSR instead sent generous supplies into West Berlin, in order to convince the residents of West Berlin to agree to Soviet control. The West Berliners refused to accept anything from USSR. The Western Allies had to consider their next move carefully, in response to Stalin's aggressive move. It was like playing a game of chess between the superpowers. His opponent moves their pieces across the board, in order to gain a strategic position. The West did not want to risk war by forcing their way through the blockade, which was a possible first option. However, they also knew that if they did nothing it would be seen by Stalin as a sign of weakness, and would probably result in a communist takeover of the whole of Berlin. So they decided on a third alternative, the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year the West supplied the western sectors of Berlin by air with all requirements, including food, fuel, building materials and medical supplies. This helped the West Berliners to survive, and resist the Soviets. The West, in response to Stalin's attempt at brinkmanship, thus made their own strategic move, believing that Stalin would not dare risk an aggressive response from the West, if he ordered his soldiers to shoot down their aeroplanes. In May 1949, when it was clear to Stalin that the West would not give up Berlin, he called off the blockade and the land routes were reopened. This crisis intensified the tension between the superpowers and could have escalated into direct conflict between the superpowers. Since both sides had nuclear capabilities, a nuclear war would have destroyed the whole world. After this crisis, Germany was formally divided into two separate states. In May 1949 the three Western zones became the German Federal Republic or West Germany, with Bonn as its capital. West Berlin was included as part of West Germany. In October 1949, the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. Germany then remained divided for the next 40 years. The tension between the superpowers also led to the creation of two military alliances. As part of its policy of containment, the USA formed a military alliance with its Western European allies, called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO in 1949 as a form of protection against Soviet aggression and the spread of communism. They were concerned about Stalin making another aggressive move like the Berlin Blockade, and they knew that they were not strong enough to stand alone. In response, the USSR and its allies formed the Warsaw Treaty Organization or the Warsaw Pact, which consisted of the Eastern European countries already under the influence of USSR. The spheres of influence of the superpowers stretched beyond Europe. The West formed other anti-communist alliances, linked to NATO, such as the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was formed in 1954. It included 3 Asian nations, which were the Philippines, Thailand and Pakistan, together with the USA, Britain, France, Australia and New Zealand. The Central Treaty Organization was formed in the Middle East in 1955 with states such as Iran, Iraq, Pakistan and Turkey, together with the USA and Britain. The USSR responded to the formation of NATO by forming the Warsaw Treaty Organization, or Warsaw Pact, with its East European satellites. As part of the Warsaw Pact agreement, Soviet troops remained in most Warsaw Pact countries. However, the USSR experienced problems when some Warsaw Pact members, such as Hungary, threatened to leave in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968, when the Czech people rose up in revolt against Soviet domination. Using brutal force against those who resisted, the Soviet government then announced the Brezhnev Doctrine, named after the Soviet leader at the time. This defined a Soviet bloc country as a socialist one-party state belonging to the Warsaw Pact. It stated that the Warsaw Pact had the right to intervene in any member state which threatened to break away from the bloc. The superpowers also tried to protect their spheres of interest through espionage, which means spying. Both the American Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, and the Soviet Committee for State Security, or KGB, built up huge networks of spies to learn secret information about the other side. The CIA and KGB were often involved in international conflicts around the world, providing information and training to the enemy of their enemy. The superpowers also used propaganda to convince their own citizens and people in other parts of the world that their cause was just. The competition between the two sides even extended to popular culture, sport and many other fields. Tension between the superpowers escalated, and this affected the rest of the world, as will be discussed in part 3. Thank you for watching this video, and please remember to subscribe to the History Crew channel.